Hello. So the idea I'm going to talk about is transpartisanship. And in particular, it was suggested to me that I might talk a bit about the nature and history of conservative support for employee ownership, since that's something I've been doing some reporting on recently. Maybe my remarks I was not at the sessions yesterday, so and if there was a Sanders staffer quoting Reagan, maybe my remarks here are superfluous and redundant, but nonetheless, I did bring along, this is not the actual letter, a letter that Louis Kelso, who was the person who originally designed the concept of the employee stock ownership plan, wrote to Ronald Reagan in December of 1980, shortly after Reagan was elected, shortly before Reagan took office. He says, "Your election as President of the United States is the only event in the grim national and international economic scene which promises a glimmer of hope." Now, I know what you might be thinking. Maybe he says that to all the incoming presidents. It's a great way to butter people up. I use it all the time. But it's, in fact, he went on to make a specifically conservative case for employee ownership and said, "A conservative society is one in which the entire population makes an effort to perpetuate itself and its institutions. There has never been such a thing. Only societies with minorities who are conservative because only they have income-producing wealth to conserve, and who are therefore pitted against a majority who do not." The object of his plans, he said, was to spread more capital ownership to that majority, and therefore speedily create a conservative society. Now, why did Kelso think that Reagan might be receptive to this? Well, for one thing, he had met with Reagan before when Reagan was governor of California, because Reagan had an aide, Peter Hannaford, who was a big employee ownership advocate. And in fact, Reagan had given a speech in 1974, which I'm pretty sure Hannaford wrote, in which, at Bohemian Grove of all places, where he called for what he called an Industrial Homestead Act, which would expand capital ownership more broadly, and he particularly looked at employee ownership as a way to do that. And a year later, he issued a commentary that said a lot of the same things and name-checked Kelso specifically. So Kelso had reason to believe that he might be receptive. And in fact, Reagan did do some things as president. In 1984, he signed the Deficit Reduction Act that included a little proviso tucked away in there that expanded tax benefits for banks and others lending for employee purchases. That didn't come from the White House. That came from a left-right alliance on Capitol Hill, but he signed it. And the Reagan administration put out a report a little later. It's a fascinating document, sort of putting forward worker ownership as an alternative to state socialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there was some discussion of doing something similar vis-a-vis the Solidarity Revolt in Poland, although that made it to the National Security Council. As far as I can tell, it didn't make it any further. And I'm not saying all this to try to make an argument for Ronald Reagan as the secret champion of worker power. The more important thing is that he had people close to him who did sincerely. I don't know how sincere or how close this was to his heart, but there were people around him that was close to their heart, and it was close to their heart for conservative reasons. People like Hannaford, people like Norman Bailey, like John McClary, who was an advocate not just of ESOPs, but of cooperatives and self-management, who were, and for that matter, people who in Congress, who we ordinarily think of as conservatives or sometimes coming from the right wing of libertarianism, who have repeatedly introduced legislation like this. Dana Rohrabacher would be one example. And what were the reasons that they had for coming to this? In some cases, it was the idea that Kelso put forward in his letter that this was a way of giving people a greater stake in the society and wanting to conserve it. In other cases, it was the idea that this might be a way of sort of a socially responsible approach to privatization and having labor feeling like they have a stake in introducing things to the market. In fact, Hannaford, 2 years before that speech he probably wrote, he ran for Congress in Berkeley, and that was part of his platform, sort of ESOP-based privatization. He lost to Ron Dellums, who was also interested in employee ownership from a rather different ideological direction. I think that's like the most Berkeley race possible, an ESOP Republican against a DSA Democrat. In some cases, obviously, there's a lot of interest on the right in entrepreneurship, and that can lead people to these ideas. And there's also an interest sometimes in devolving power. Now, generally, the idea of devolving both governmental and corporate power is something that, if you're thinking of people outside the conventional left, that talking about it, it's going to be a certain sort of libertarian, kind of on the left wing of the libertarian spectrum. But recently, on the populist right, some of the same ideas have come up. And in general, there are so many different motives here and so many different contexts. I mean, I mentioned the new right, that most of the folks I've discussed are talking about this in an open market, free market way. In the new right, it's more likely to be in the context of industrial policy. You have bringing the people with their notions who are coming from the left or coming from the center. You might have so many contexts and so many varieties of the idea that you run a bit of a risk that you can have a broad-based spectrum of people who like the idea in an abstract but can't necessarily unite around a common platform. But fortunately, this is called 5 Big Ideas and not 5 detailed proposals for a broad-based cross-ideological platform. So I'm off the hook. I'm leaving it to you to figure out how to bring people together. Thank you.